Hello and good morning, dear Good Morning L&D community. I'm super happy to send you a teaser for our latest Unleash special podcast that we didn't record in Paris because Julian, our podcast guest, unfortunately didn't make it to Paris. So we just came by and visited him this morning in Berlin. And Julian is a partner at McKinsey with a huge experience in HR and HR transformation. And we had a super interesting discussion about the future of HR and the L&D function. And I think what was really striking for me was how does an AI transformation actually really work, and what's the role HR and L&D has to play in it to make it work. Then we were discussing very controversial about skill-based organization, whether it's just a buzz or if it's really needed. And you will be surprised to hear his answers. I can already promise that one. And then we were talking about a very concrete example from his work experience with a big company, which is, where the CEO is challenging the CHRO whether there's really a need for an L&D function because he just simply doesn't see the impact. So I think these are three very cool examples, and there is much more in the podcast. So please listen in, and also, of course, listen to all the other amazing podcasts that we recorded at Unleash, where you're going to hear more about our topics. Julian, you meet a lot of companies. That's the job of a consultant. You meet a lot of your top executive in those companies. What is on top of their minds right now when it comes to their businesses? What challenges are they facing, and what role do people play in these kind of challenges and worries ahead?
Yeah, it's true. I meet a lot of different companies, and in these companies, some top executives. Mostly these are the CHOs, because most of my work these days is on HR. I think there's really one topic that's really top of mind for almost any CHO I talk about. And that is, what does AI mean for the HR function? And I think the reason for that is quite obvious, because I think everyone feels that, and we've been saying this for many years now, but everyone feels that this time around, it could really be disruptive what this new technology means for the HR function. I think HR function honestly hasn't changed much in the past 20 years, despite there having been a lot of attempts to automate and digitize the HR function. When I started doing HR, which was when I joined McKinsey back in 2013, everyone was talking about RPA, robotic process automation. Everyone said this is going to revolutionize the HR function. All of the admin tasks will be absorbed. Finally, the HR function will be strategic. In a sense, people are saying exactly the same today, just now not RPA, but Gen AI. But given that Gen AI is so much easier to implement than RPA, I actually think all of the CHOs I talk to are absolutely right in the sense that they ask about what does AI mean for my function.
I think, at least what I sense in the business when I talk to board members and so on, there is this big bet on AI, mainly driven also from the US, driven also by the kind of markets pushing companies to win on productivity, win on efficiency. But then again, how does it work, right? Because I think that's you read news in the US that people or companies are laying off bigger chunks of people, especially in white-collar jobs. Germany, that's not so easy, but there is a big group of baby boomers leaving the companies. Is that the AI implementation strategy, letting baby boomers leave and everyone who's remaining plus AI will somehow close the gap and even create some productivity wins on the way?
I think you touched on a number of important points in that question, or in that comment/question. I think number one, you're absolutely right that obviously in many industries in Germany right now, there's an immense pressure to reduce costs. And what I've also seen a couple of times now is that basically folks call something a Gen AI program also for HR. In reality, it's just a very mundane restructuring and a cost cutting of like 15-20%. However, then Gen AI comes into the mix because the CHO wonders if he or she can actually maintain the same service level with 20% less people thanks to Gen AI, right? But there's obviously kind of like, I'd say the the dire situation, for instance, German automotive industry is actually a driver for adopting Gen AI much more quickly. In fact, I'd say probably if you look around HR functions in Germany, automotive is leading in terms of adoption because they have to. They have fewer people, fewer resources they need to restructure, and they try to maintain service level with AI. That being said, I think if you look overall at this AI debate in HR, there's a massive gap, there's a massive delta between what's being talked about, what's actually being done on the ground. And we've been doing some surveys in large companies in Germany, 1,000 plus FTE. We find that something around 15, max 20%, depending on industry, have actually adopted some kind of AI. And if you then double click and ask, guys, what have you really done? 90% have basically done some kind of pilots. And I always like to say they're stuck in what I call kind of like pilotitis, which means they are unable to actually move from one or two pilots into something that really kind of like transforms the HR function. So even though we've been talking so much about AI and HR, we're still very early days in Germany, and I also think anywhere else in the world. That being said, last thought here, I think there's a few examples, there's a few front runners of companies who've started to go above and beyond, sometimes too far above and beyond, but also some examples where it's really worked. And I just want to pick out one example because I recently helped a company also implement this. We looked in the company in the entire HR function and try to figure out where are the largest pain points and what could you do to really make the HR function better, but also more affordable with the help of Gen AI. And one of the use cases we zoomed into was in the realms of recruiting. And we actually went into personnel marketing, where the company was spending a lot of money on external marketing agencies, helping them to do their Instagram, their TikTok, etc. And what we did is we actually built with them an agent who understood what exactly the marketing of this company looked like, what was the kind of like wording, what was the kind of like vibe you wanted to transport. And that agent then, in kind of like MVP version 1, could just produce stepstone job descriptions, still kind of helpful. But then version 2, we taught that agent to also produce Instagram posts. And we also taught the agent to produce TikTok videos. The company does also a lot of recruiting via TikTok. And that actually saved the company multi-million-dollar amount per year. That entire marketing is now run by 2 full-time folks and an intern. And I think it's a great example of how AI can save you a lot of costs. And my sense is also, I actually think the marketing they now do is much better than what they did before. Because if some external agency does it, they'll never understand the heart of your company as much as if your own people produce this. So overall, I think, there's a lot of kind of like Gen AI talk when in reality it's about efficiency, but I think there's also some great examples out there now where it's truly about making the HR function more emboldened and better.
Yeah. Okay, so I see, of course, the main topic every CHRO is basically kind of challenged these days on is how can you leverage this AI transformation of our company? And this is somehow two-folded, right? On the one hand, HR is challenged on their costs and their, way of operating and, using AI, right, to do this leaner, faster, more efficient, more impactful, as the, example you just shared shows. But at the same time, I think HR is also asked to help the rest of the organization make progress with AI, right? And I think then we're, immediately in the skills discussion, right? How can we enable leaders, right, to imagine this different type of work, with AI? How can they lead teams with AI and real employees in that sense? How can we help each individual, like, the 2 HR professionals and the intern you just shared about to, suddenly run this HR marketing function, with AI agents. So there's this, big kind of skill gap and how do you feel it's HR, keeping up with this kind of two-folded challenge?
Yeah. So I agree. It's when it comes to AI, it's about rewiring your own HR function, but it's also about helping the rest of the company get ready for AI. I think there's multiple asks that CHROs are these days confronted with. One is actually, and you haven't mentioned that yet, that a lot of CHROs suddenly also ask to redo their workforce planning. Because obviously a lot of CEOs say, well, if now my entire company becomes agentic, there's a lot of agents doing the work, what is actually the right workforce mix, right? And what kind of people do I need with what skills or what level of seniority? So workforce planning, I think also once again resurfaces. I wonder honestly to what extent that truly is a helpful instrument. I had dinner last night with a CHRO, and she shared about her previous job, how she introduced workforce planning. And she said, actually, we did it with like Fraunhofer Institute. It was very kind of like through driver-based model. We thought through kind of like all of the job categories and how much folks will need in 5 years. And then she said, it was actually really interesting. We had some great debates. And then she closed by saying, well, in the end, though, we completely underestimated what would happen with electrification. Like there's much less electrification now than we thought there would be. So numbers were great, but they're all wrong because obviously we didn't really know how the world looks like in 5 years. And I think something similar is at play here because I mean, just think back like 3 years. I mean, so much stuff is happening now, technologically speaking, that we just couldn't envisage. So strategic workforce planning, it's always it can spark some interesting debates. I think you shouldn't spend too much time on generating these numbers. I think probably you need to overinvest a lot more in your operative workforce planning. So like, how does your workforce look like 12 months from now, 18 months from now? Because I think you can have a realistic view on that, right? I think 5 years in the future, it's tricky, and I would always recommend keep it at a very kind of like high job family based level. But I think that's something CHROs are being asked. You're also right that CHROs also are being asked in terms of like, hey, can you equip the existing workforce with AI skills? So can you boost our L&D? Or can you teach our top 200 talents very operational stuff on how to use AI? And my sense here is not enough is happening. And I'm speaking very much here from a German perspective. But obviously the German economy is in a dire state. It's like third year of recession. So everyone is looking where to save some euros. And unfortunately, what I see is that if the HR function gets approached, that they also need to save a bit. Oftentimes within the HR function, it's anything related to L&D, talent development, that experiences the first cut. So on L&D, I once a year run a survey of 500 HR professionals in Germany. And in 2023, I was very stunned to learn that of those HR professionals, 20% said we actually don't do learning development, 20%, which means 1 out of 5 companies, more than 1,000 FTE, don't do L&D. And I was like, that's insane. Yeah. Now we redid the survey in 2024. What came out of it was suddenly that number had jumped up to 40%.
What?
So 40% said last year, we actually, and these are not DAX companies, but 1,000 plus FTE, we didn't provide any learning development to our folks. Right? And I think the reason for that is very obvious. In this like time of recession, the first thing that gets cut is actually L&D, because many CEOs don't see how it's directly, positively impacting the bottom line, right? And that's obviously a big problem because you would need some kind of L&D if you want to bring across AI skills. And then final point here, I think something similar I see on talent development. So I think for quite a few years, we all discussed the massive labor shortage in the labor market. So a lot of companies started investing in their own internal talent development, started setting up these like talent pools, top 200, top 500, et cetera, et cetera. What I see is also that is retracting because let's be honest, right now, there's no labor shortage in the labor market. It's very easy to get someone for almost any kind of white collar job. Different story for blue collar, but for any kind of like white collar job, you can put out a job ad, you'll have within 24 hours, like 300 applicants, of which a pretty high share is actually not that bad, right? So companies also understand that it's easy to recruit externally. So they stop investing also in these like talent development engines. And I think this is all very understandable from a short-term perspective. From a medium-term perspective, obviously, needless to say, this is very stupid because if you don't equip your folks with the right AI skills now, I think some of them will equip themselves. But you're going to lose out against those who still do this today and then will have an advantage in the near future.
There's a lot in it. and I think first thing that popped up in my mind that I think read yesterday, I don't know, an article I think of one of your colleagues in the US who basically pulled out a study where they said I think they interviewed 80 CEOs and asked them about where they want to invest, in the future of their business. And I think 80% said they want to invest in AI. And I think, only 20% said they also want to invest in upskilling. And I think that's maybe really, making also your point of many companies not really having an L&D at all, right? And that this number was even increasing, which I think is quite shocking. And the other thing is, what I want to dig a bit deeper in is this notion of, well, there's no longer this kind of labor shortage, but at the same time, I feel like many companies are realizing that whatever is ahead of them now, they have to somehow make it with the people they have, because there are no others, right? Because there are hiring freezes. There's a labor market that maybe has a lot of white collar, but maybe not in the future skills that I really need, right, to drive my business, which comes back to our educational system in a way. So is it really an option to save money in L&D for a business that wants to, remain ahead?
Yeah. Lots of stuff to unpack also in that comment/question, Moritz. A couple of thoughts. Number one, I think still one of the challenges for the HR function these days is how do you even receive any kind of investment for AI? It doesn't even need to be upskilling, but just also pure tech investment. And a chart I oftentimes give now the CHROs I'm befriended with is a chart that basically is analysis of our think tank, McKinsey Global Institute, looking into efficiency potentials from an AI perspective per corporate function. And what comes out of that chart is that the number one function with the greatest potential is actually HR. Intuitively, that makes a lot of sense, because just think about all of the admin work we still have in HR. And I think the way to use that chart then is to say, hey, we got to start somewhere in the company with AI. Why don't we start there where we have the largest potential, lots of low-hanging fruits? Why isn't HR the speedboat for the AI change we want to see in the company? And I think that's actually working out now in an increasing number of instances where companies say, and I've just done 2-3 projects on this also this year, where it was exactly the same, where companies say, let's start with HR to evidence that AI actually works. Now, I'm fully with you that then the way the money is spent once you have it is typically false. Let's be honest about it. A rule of thumb I always like to share with my clients is the 70-20-10 rule, which you'll also know from learning, but I've kind of like reframed it a bit to the AI age. So I think if you look at the investments that you got to make, 10%, I think, of these investments typically are investments that really directly go into like building some kind of application or amending an application you've got off the shelf. 20% may be needed for modernizing your tech stack, but 70% I think are needed exactly to what you say, for rewiring. And what I mean with rewiring is like rethinking your processes, rethinking your org chart, upskilling your people, doing the change management. And if you don't do that, you're stuck in what I originally said, pilotitis. You'll never go beyond this pilot, because the pilot will not be widely adopted, right? And I think that is something, I feel like you can't preach that often enough, right? That it's not going to work, but it's still fascinating to see how basically, I mean, right now, it's the other way around. 70% of the investments goes into pure development of the AI application, which doesn't even take that long any longer these days. And then maybe 10% is spent on topics such upskilling and change. And I think that is one of the fundamental reasons why right now AI at scale in German industry is not moving ahead.
Wow, I love that, and I think the same occurs, I guess, also to the business, right? Building on this idea that HR is maybe this kind of sandbox, for the whole organization to learn how to leverage AI.
I also wanted to, if I may jump in again.
Yes, of course.
Because you also had a second part of the question, which I skipped now, which was around L&D and to what extent you should invest.
That was exactly where I wanted to go. Yeah,
exactly. L&D. So let me also unpack that one a bit. So I'm doing a small piece right now for an automotive supplier, where basically the CHRO is pressured by the CEO if all of these L&D investments even make any sense. Because the CEO says, hey, look, situation is not good. We're spending a lot of money on L&D. I don't see how that learning catalog is actually equipping my folks here in the company with skills that then they can do a better job tomorrow. And we're right now in the process of reviewing the entire portfolio, rethinking about what are even the skills you want to build in this portfolio, rethinking also how you bring across those skills, maybe in a cheaper way with agents, but also with a non-cheaper way with experiences. But most importantly, we're also rethinking how do you actually measure that this learning has value. And one of the buzzwords I always like to use here is like, you got to figure out what's the return on learning. And that return on learning got to be connected actually with the strategy of the company, with a P&L. And I think for some chunks of L&D, that's actually pretty easy to do. And one of these chunks is, for instance, in the realms of procurement. So recently did another big project where we went into the procurement function, and the procurement function said, we gotta procure much more efficiently. And then we developed a 10-month learning journey for this procurement function. And we actually did some A/B testing. So we put 50 people into that learning journey. And then the rest of the procurement function, I think 450 people or so, were not in that learning journey. And then we measured after the 10 month, how did those folks procure from a money perspective? And in fact, they procured, I think, something like 5 or 6% more cheaply than the folks who hadn't done the learning program. And 5 to 6% more cheaply doesn't sound so much, but if you look at the absolute values of what they're procuring, that's millions and millions of euros that company is saving. And that to me is a prime example of return on learning. If somebody goes through a procurement learning program, they should procure more cheaply. If someone does a sales training program, they should be able to sell more. And I think you as a learning provider also then need to bring the evidence to the table that that is the case. That's also how you justify the price tag for that program. And I think that's a logic we need to get into.
Yeah.
And I think that's also then a logic the CEO understands, and where suddenly the CEO is willing to invest in L&D again.
Yeah, I mean, I love the example, and I think it's a also great example for this differentiation between, you know, measuring the output versus measuring the outcome, right? Which I think L&D is so stuck in. You know, I think most corporate, you know, learning success is still measured in the learning time, right? Which goes also back, unfortunately, to, you know, the company business reports, sustainability reports, and so on. You know, where there is still, you know, the learning hours, the KPI, right? For, you know. But that's exactly the output, but it's not really the outcome, as your example states. And
I agree. And if I may jump on this, so my automotive supplier I'm working with right now, obviously they also look into learning hours. They also look into participation rate, which is also nice. I mean, don't even know what to say. And they look into
the happy sheets.
The happy sheets, exactly. They look into satisfaction. How happy are folks with the learning? Which obviously is also, if you look into like learning science, excuse my French here, but it's one of the stupidest indicators you can look at. There's a lot of academic research out there that actually showcases that the professors that have the easiest classes, where you oftentimes learn the least, also the one where the students are most satisfied, right? And the ones where, you may have a very low satisfaction because it's so tough. Looking 5 years back, it's oftentimes been the class where you learned the most, right? So I'm fully with you. Like, there's so much to do on like learning KPIs and thinking through how to actually, how to actually do this. And in a sense, I mean, it's a idiom has been used many times now, but never waste a good crisis. In a sense, you could say, I think the current crisis we're in hopefully also triggers some of the rethinking that's going to be productive also for the next 5, 10, maybe even 15 years. So.
Yeah, I mean, many companies feel that they found the answer in skills, right? Because, you know, skills, sorry, so you see your expression, your face expression. Well, at least they think, okay, if we can, and that comes back to the strategic workforce planning piece. If we can say what skills we actually need to be more successful in our business, you know, pointing to the business strategy and the transformation goals and so on, and we know what the skills are today, we can, you know, close the gap. And with that, we can suddenly, measure an outcome and not just the output. Speaking of skills growth in, future critical skills like, I don't know, AI.
Yeah. So there's lots of debates these days about skills and skill management and skill-based organization. The other day, I actually turned down a keynote invitation where I was supposed to speak about skills-based organization. And I turned it down because I said, right now, I don't think I'm in the state to keynote on that because I don't think I believe in it. And let me try to unpack it a bit, actually, by asking a question back, which is, Moritz, how would you define, like, what's a skill for you? Like, what's a, like, how do you define it?
Well, I would say it's problem solving for me is.
But that's an example. That's not a definition of.
No. But I wanted to take it from that kind of example. It's something. For me, it's this analogy of a muscle, right? It's a muscle that I train, and the more I train it, the better I use it, and the better my results are in it. But I feel like you have a point here.
So I like the metaphor. I think it's not a definition, it's a metaphor you've shared now of a skill being like a muscle.
Yeah.
But I think if you ask 5 people of like, what's even a skill, you get like 8 different answers.
And one metaphor.
And one metaphor. And I think in a sense, 10 years ago, we all talked about competencies. Suddenly we talk about skills. If I look at some of my clients, what used to be a competence suddenly has become a skill. So I'm like, okay, is there really any kind of difference? So I think there's a lot of like fuzziness here in terms of like, what is even a skill? I think it is very difficult for a company to identify the skills that matter. I think it's even more difficult than at an individual level to figure out like, where do you stand in a certain skill? So how do you measure kind of like the proficiency in a skill? And I've now seen many companies go into skill management. My automotive supplier I'm in right now also went into skill management. And real example again, what they showed me is they have this like skill taxonomy where they have 1,000 skills in there. And they were so proud of that skill taxonomy. It's 1,000 skills. What a tough piece of work they went through. And I told them, guys, like, this is what a befriended CFO of mine, she always says, like, these are skill cemeteries. Skill cemeteries, because they'll be developed once and nobody will ever use them outside of the L&D team. Because what are you going to do with 1,000 skills? Like, imagine you're like supposed as an employee to build your own skill profile. Then you open up this like Excel sheet with 1,000 skills and then your boss tells you, okay, pick the 20 that matter. Who's going to do that, right? So I think this entire topic of skill management, I think we're imprecise in like thinking through what is even a skill. I think once we get started, we oftentimes get lost in extreme complexity. And then I think oftentimes these skill projects, like they don't even reach the CHO. They're just like entertainment for the folks in the L&D. Yeah, sorry for being so cynical, but I've really seen a lot of, I think at least 80% of the skill projects I've seen are complete and utter waste of time. I think there's a few examples, and there's a few examples where I think I find it more promising in terms of like what's being done. And I think the 2-3 things that hold for all of the examples is, number one, force yourself not to go crazy with the number of skills. So I think actually, like, if you're an employee, you should not have more than kind of like max 30 skills to pick from, of which maybe half or maybe even 2/3 are generic skills that apply for everyone. Classical skills like problem solving, maybe some basic IT skills, digital literacy, prompting, digital learning, and then some will be very specific to your role. And then I think that's number one. I think number two, if you want to do successful skill management, it also can't come across as an assessment. I think it's also a big problem why then the organization pushes back. So if people feel, oh, I'm getting assessed now, like back in school, if I'm like a 3 or 4 now on problem solving, it's gonna drop, right? So I think it needs to be more like a instrument where you say it complements a bit our development. And I think it also needs to be something where basically the employee themselves decide on to what extent they use it and to what extent they also judge for themselves on whether like they think they have the skill or they don't. So it can come across as like threatening. And then I think third, if you do skill management, you also got to think properly about how to do it from a IT perspective. Because too many times, also again, my automotive supplier, like how did they send me their skill taxonomy? An Excel sheet. So I mean, that's just like the user experience couldn't be worse. So I think you also have to think about like, is there an IT solution that aids the maintenance of this like skill library? But even then, I think there's only, and yeah, you tell me if you want to hear more about this, but I think there's relatively few examples in industry where skill management has actually done well, and where I'd say doing skill management adds to how the company is doing overall. Oftentimes, honestly, I think it's just like L&D folks wasting a lot of time and driving other people nuts when they come with their 1,000 skills in their skill taxonomy. Yeah?
Well, that's really interesting, and it's controversial. I like that. So how I saw it is that skills were or are a very good compromise between HR and the business, right? To talk the same language. And what I mean with that is that what we had earlier, right? That, L&D, HR is talking about learning, is talking about training, and the business is talking, like in your example from the procurement team, is about, hey guys, we need, more cheaply procurement. And what's kind of the common denominator? What's in between? What's this kind of currency or the same language we can talk in order to get there? And then it's, I don't know, for example, our skill of, I don't know, searching providers, potential providers with large language models. With that, we can, I don't know, and that's the skill, right? That we need to train our procurement team so that this gives them a better pool of potential suppliers that can help us then I don't know. I'm not in a procurement team, but to get better prices and procure more cheaply. So I always felt this idea of becoming a skill-driven organization is a way to talk more about outcome versus outputs. And technology and AI, and also this idea of talent marketplace, opportunity marketplace, creates a certain accessibility and transparency in the organization. Wouldn't you agree?
Very leading question. A couple of thoughts on this one. So first of all, I'm not sure I agree that skills is the language that allows to translate between business and HR. I think skills is something that really is in the HR bubble, and we're all in the HR bubble, and then we start telling ourselves it's so obvious what it is. But I mean, I've worked on building skill taxonomies with a lot of companies, with a lot of business units. They oftentimes really struggle to grasp the concept. Let's go back to my procurement example to unpack this a bit more. If you think about how success was measured in this example, it was basically by less euros saved. And that's the indicator. I think that's a fantastic indicator because that is truly understood by everyone, by the HR L&D folks who built the program, but also by the head of procurement, but also by the CEO who spends the money on such a program, right? So I think if you consider like KPIs, return on learning, I think the closer these are to your P&L, the easier it is to make the case that this makes a lot of sense. Obviously though, if you then look into the procurement program, the learning program that you built, there's a lot of skills underlying that you want to teach in order to make sure people actually spend less on procurement. And before you design your program, it is very important to obviously explicate what are the skills you want to build, right? So I'm not saying like all skills are stupid. There's obviously like step 0 in designing a learning journey, but that's a very specific use case here, right? It's not, that's different to skills-based organization where the skills are everywhere. This is really like the foundation of your learning program. And and for such a procurement learning program, I mean, what are the skills you would bring across? Maybe just 2 examples. I mean, one would be probably a negotiation skill. If you're in procurement, you got to be great in negotiation. Second, there's probably also a skill around like compliance, regulatory issues. It's also a huge topic. To give a third one, there's probably also for the area of procurement that you're doing, you also need to understand like the market dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. So these are kind of like, I call them now skills, but in reality you also see like it's a mixture out of like, almost like you could say attributes, characteristics, negotiation, knowledge, which would be kind of like market understanding, which we all subsume under the topic of skills, which to me is fine. It's just kind of like, to me, an umbrella term. But what I see again and again is actually that when you go to like, and in this case, I did it myself, you go to the folks in procurement and they're fantastic at procurement. And then you ask them, why are you so good at this? Can you please tell me the 10 skills that make you great? They struggle. They really struggle. And it's something you gotta co-create with them. Because they, like the knowledge or the skills they have are tacit. So they have not really explicated from themselves how it is that they're so good. They've just been doing it for 10 years, so somehow they've built that muscle. But they're not fully aware like where that muscle sits, how it looks like, et cetera, et cetera. So it's actually a big chunk of work between HR, L&D, and the business to like distill the skills. And you'll sometimes also, when you design the journey or once you run it, you'll actually realize you distilled the wrong skills. Everyone has been saying skill X is super important and you missed skill Y. So I think this example though shows that skills are, there's useful use cases for skills, such as beginning of a learning journey, but it's not something that automatically builds the bridge between business and HR. I think it's something where both sides really need to invest heavily to build that bridge together. And then if you build it, it's a good thing in this use case. But yeah, that's what I mean with like, I don't like that people basically these days say skills are the silver bullet to better HR. Yes, they're great use cases for skills. I'd always recommend like go use case by use case. I also think like skills can be fantastic in recruiting, for instance. But what bugs me is like this, these like sweeping claims of like everything will be better. It's a bit like, I mean, skills was already the big claim before AI. It's a bit like with kind of like AI. I think we gotta move away from these like mega buzzwords in HR. We just love to have a new buzzwords every 2 to 3 years and rather think about like what are the specific problems we have and can an operationalization of this buzzword somehow help us to solve this problem.
And that's actually interesting because it reminds me on your article with the headline "No HR," and the reason why I think it's interesting is that I sometimes hear that really seasoned leaders in the business or also in HR say, well, many HR processes, and maybe the skill-driven organization is one of these HR processes, they try to kind of heal bad leadership. Because if a leader would, really take his or her role as an entrepreneurial leader and not as a process manager of HR processes, for example, talking about skills and developing the people, which I think in the end there's no one better in the organization than the leader, him or herself, knowing the business, knowing the technology, knowing the person, working in my team and to develop this person. Is that maybe also part of the problem that we try to cure maybe bad leadership or no leadership with HR processes, and with that, even make it more complicated?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in what you just said with which I agree. But let me first start with what I think is a bit of a bigger problem in the HR bubble, of which I've been part for 12 years. So I'm probably also part of the problem, obviously. I think one of the big problems is like it's very cozy in this bubble. It feels great to be in this bubble. It's an extremely consensus-driven bubble. So there's very few topics we disagree with. So I now said skills-based organization. I don't believe in it. Immediately, you were like, oh my God, this is so controversial, Julian. How can you say this? Case in point. Yeah. Nobody actually, like there's a buzzword and nobody says, I disagree. And I think that's actually a problem in this HR bubble, because if there's no disagreement, I think there's a lack of sharp thinking sometimes, and we're not progressing as much as we should be progressing. because we just all nod to everything. And again, my dinner last night with the CHO, she said, Julian, when I looked 20 years ago at the top 10 trends in HR, 20 years ago, 2005, she said, more or less, it's going to be the same as today. I mean, how sad is that? And I think this is also partially driven by the fact that we just always agree instead of having also sometimes tough conversations about what works and what doesn't. Now, let me jump from this now to the no HR piece. Happy you brought it up. I got a bit of a shitstorm for that one, but also a lot of appreciation, to be honest. Yeah, so I think it's, actually, I think 70% were very excited about it. 30% were like, Julian, why? Yeah? So what did my co-author Kafa Yunusi from formerly SAP and I, what do we say? So we basically, first of all, we call this entire piece no HR because we were both so bugged about the fact that everyone just always agrees, and we just wanted to we wanted people to wake up, and we thought, well, writing about HR, starting with no HR is a great way. But essentially what we say in this piece is, if you look at the contemporary HR function right now, number one, a lot of the stuff can be automated, can be Gen AI'd. I think everyone agrees with this. And we've done some estimates on this, but I think even in the conservative estimates, probably a third of the tasks in the HR function can easily be absorbed by, doesn't even need to be Gen AI, can sometimes just be automation. So then you're suddenly down to like 70% of the HR function in terms of like hours worked. Now, I'm coming now also to your point. Once you've done that, I think you need to think about roles and responsibilities. Yes. Who actually does what? And I don't mean this just in the HR function, but what we've seen in recent years is actually the past 10 years, there's no other function that has grown as fast as the HR function in terms of FTE headcount. So many folks have been added to HR. And my sense is the reason for this is not just kind of like some kind of like labor market, ESG, whatever regulations. It's the fact that business managers have just started delegating stuff they didn't want to do to the HR function. And I think some of that stuff should never have been delegated. Interviews. I know now some companies where 100% of the interviewing is done by HR. And I'm like, dude, like those are folks that are going to work in your team as a business manager. Like at least do the final interview. Onboarding, the first week. I mean, it sets the tone for your entire time at a company. Why is HR running 90% of the onboarding? Why is that not the business being much more involved? Performance management. Obviously, HR needs to be involved there to some extent. But again, I feel like business has pushed too much on HR. Exit interviews. Nobody likes exit interviews. I think you, as the boss, should also do an exit interview. You can learn a lot about your team and your leadership style during the exit interview. So I think business in the past 10 years has pushed too many tasks into HR. I think we got to reevaluate that. And I think once we reevaluate, I think some tasks will go back to business. And then I already said like 100% of HR function, 30% are gone because of AI, so we're at 70%. I think maybe another 20, 25% can be pushed back to business. And then we're suddenly at an HR function half the size, or maybe even, if you're being radical, 30% of the size. And I think then, and you'll still have an HR function, right? So no HR, it's a bit inspired by the kind of like the no-code movement. No-code movement was also about making coding so easy that everyone can do it. In a sense, we're saying like, no code puts coding on everyone's shoulders. We also say put HR tasks on everyone's shoulders, including business folks. Now, you'll still have an HR function in no HR, just as you still have coding in the no code movement. However, I think that function is going to be smaller. And I think, and this is truly something provocative now, I think something to then consider is, once you have this like core chunk of the HR function, does it even need to be its own function? Or could it not be that you actually merge that function with another function or even other functions? And I think what's exciting is that exactly this is happening. So literally when Kava and I were about to publish our article, Moderna, we all still know Moderna, came out early May, and they said, hey, we actually abolished our HR function. And we merged it with the IT function, and the CHO is now the Chief People and Digital Officer. In September, AXA came out with exactly the same. And last week, I just talked to another C-level executive. They're also doing the same now. It's not yet in the press, so I can't share. But I think Kava and I, we both see that there's actually a lot of folks out there rethinking if HR needs to be its own function. And I think that is exciting. And I think actually also from the perspective of someone in HR for the CHO, being merged with the IT function and then becoming the head of both of these functions, it massively elevates you. And I think it's a huge promise for HR, right? So no HR is not a bunch.
And I think it really also connects what we had earlier with this, AI, transformation, making HR the kind of sandbox for HR,
Correct.
for AI, and the enablement part. I think that fits very well to that piece of our conversation as well.
100. Yeah.
I mean, I want to land our conversation at this story that you shared about time is flying. I mean, I could do this for the whole day, but unfortunately, we have to come somehow to an end. But I want to land our conversation on this story you shared about a CHRO approaching you with this question: do we really need an L&D function? And you said, kind of provocative, no HR. Is it also no L&D?
So that was the CEO approaching the CHO, whether that L&D function is still needed. I think the L&D function these days is more important than ever. It's obviously more important than ever. I think we've lived for a long time in a world where continuous learning has been a thing, but let's be honest, it's become even more of a thing, right? So I think permanently, no matter what you do, you're always asked to keep your skills, to use that term again, to keep your skills up to date. And the L&D function should facilitate that. They gotta play a role there. So I'm actually very concerned, but what I currently see, that the L&D function is oftentimes the first sub-function HR being hit by the cuts. Because maybe you're not gonna see the impact immediately. And let's be honest, maybe also some L&D functions actually have very limited positive impact on the P&L. But I think if you actually rethink an L&D function that is totally rewired to equip with AI skills to really deliver and return on learning, then I think that's actually one of the most powerful engines in HR. It's a powerful engine for the entire company, and that type of L&D function, for sure, we need. And I can only preach to all of the CEOs, CHROs, everyone in the companies out there, to, instead of shutting it down, rather pose the question of how can we rethink it in a way that the positive impact on the business line becomes very visible to everyone out there, so that nobody will ever question again if this function should be shut down now.